Welcome to the course, Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we'll be going to talk from the same power series, and we are particularly discussing about the forbidden space in the Chinese part of, the Beijing. So today, how this whole power plays within the space, and especially in the case of the Forbidden Kingdom. And many of you might have seen a movie of The Last Emperor, which shows the lifestyle, the whole biography of the Puyi. And so these all the stories which have taken place in this kind of Forbidden Kingdom. So here, this lecture has been developed based on the readings from Kim Dovey's work on framing places, mediating power in the built form. So before starting with this, the Forbidden Cities, so the older name of Beijing is Peking, and if you look at the historic city of Beijing, you can see the outer city here, and you have the inner city boundary, and you have, this is where we refer to the kind of imperial city which was ruled by the emperors, and you have within the imperial city you have the forbidden city. So if you look at the whole picturesque painting of those days, the Ming Dynasty's painting, you can see that it is from the south to the north, where they talk about from heaven to the earth. So basically the whole movement is from the south towards the north, and in fact that is where it goes back. It takes the whole power status from a common man's side to the emperor's side, and which is where it is much more controlled version of it. And here the more deeper you are going, that is more, these are the premises which are lived with these kind of the noble class. So here in the whole city of Beijing, you can see how it is divided on the four sides. You have the Temple of Heaven, and the Temple of Agriculture, and the Temple of Moon, the Temple of Sun. So obviously this is being an east side, have the Temple of Sun, and the Temple of Moon, and the Temple of Earth, Temple of Agriculture, and Temple of Heaven. So in fact, if you look at even these walls, they also follow certain ancient philosophies of having a curvature walls, so that it can deflect the evil spirits, sort of things. That kind of understanding was there. But now in today's condition, if you look at the present Google Earth map, and this is where you have the wide moat. This is the Forbidden Kingdom, and which have a ceremonial, the access. And today's, in the present condition, you have the Tiananmen Square, and you have, this is how the whole layout is all about. And now how one can actually narrate, because Dovey actually narrates the whole series of places and how they are used and how they have been shaped in time and how they have been transforming by various political discourses. So this is what Dovey tried to explain. Now in fact it starts with the kind of Tiananmen Gate, and then you have the ceremonial access. Then this is where you have a U-shape Meridian Gate, and that is how and you have a huge moat for a kind of defensive purposes, which actually this is where you have the whole Forbidden Kingdom. And then you have the military. On one side you have two entrances, one is the civil and the ministerial entrances, and the military gate. And this is where I think you have the Hall of Supreme Harmony, and this is the same thing for the gateway. So there are a series of, it takes the whole journey takes through a series of gateways and a wide courtyards, and it is actually taking you from the whole journey is making someone to pass through a numerous, elegant spaces, and each of these spaces actually having a kind of controlled paths. Now, I will like to explain how actually Dove narrates these places along with these performatives, what kind of performatives have been performed. Now, if you look at even the present tourist map of this, if you someone walk from the Tiananmen Square, and one can actually see that you have the Meridian Gate here, and on the back side, rear side, you have the Gate of Divine Prowess, and again this is the gate of the West Flowery Gate and East Flowery Gate. So this is for the civil servants and the ministerial, and this is for the military places. But whereas you have on the outer court, you have the gate of Supreme Harmony, which you can see here, which is a gate of Supreme Harmony. And then similarly, when the one passes through the ceremonial axis, I think that's the termination point of the ceremonial axis, and then one enters into a courtyard, and that is how you can see this whole raised platform of which talks about the Hall of Supreme Harmony and the Hall of Central Harmony and the Hall of Preserved Harmony. And then, so basically these two gates, the court embedded within it, and this is a gate of heavenly purity. I think if one can look at it, that all the administrative component lies in this, and then it takes to the further royal side of it. And similarly, you have on this whole the inner court, where you can see that the Hall of Heavenly Purity and the Hall of Union and Peace and the Hall of Earthly Tranquility, and then obviously at the rear it have the Imperial Gardens. So it is little more taking from a more public to the administrative controls, and then to more of a noble, the places for the noble people. Now, Dove refers it as a kind of celestial city, and it is how even historically the notion of making the city, it is referred to kind of a connection of heaven to earth. So in fact, this whole the kingdom, it's actually started around 13th, 14th century, and then it lasted about even, a lot of transformations have been taken place until 16th, 17th century, and later down a major transformations taken place in the early 19th century till the 1989, and even in the recent phenomenon. So they call the one who approaches from the Tiananmen Gate can see the Meridian Gate. So it is actually on the south. It actually located on the north-south axis, and it is basically on the southern side of it. And this gate is in the middle place and faces sunshine directly. It is on the meridian, and hence it was named as Yumen. So this often referred as Yumen in the local, in a kind of dialect. The emperor would, so here this is a place where sometimes the emperor would appear on this gate to accept captives after a successful war. So the only place one can see that, the emperor, whenever they they had a victory over some enemies, so then when they bring all the captives, so that was the time the emperor used to come and visible. And if one walks further down onto the ceremonial axis, and that is where the ceremonial axis terminates, I would say, and this is referred as a gate of supreme harmony. So what this old photograph which we can find in the web, and you can see that this is the access to the primary ceremonial site and termination of the ceremonial axis. That's where the very long corridor actually ends. So the moment you are talking about a long corridor, a kind of access, so which is actually the path is defined. You're not able to go here and there. It's not like a Maidan, or it's not like a big square. So you are directed and you are forced to walk in that direction so that you can reach there. So a certain discipline is also carried over. And the moment you enter into that gate, and you can see, you can enter into the kind of hall of the small court, which is a kind of the outer court sort of thing, and you can see the hall of supreme harmony. So here you can how power actually plays an important role. So these buildings, these built forms are actually raised almost more than 8 meters height sometimes, and then you can see the human scale here, and you can see how it is almost raised on a particular height, so that here the ensemble was an ideogram of the world of heaven and earth, and in Chinese they say that heaven is high and earth is broad. So the floor of the court also represented the earth with terraced hall in the heavens. So here, because obviously that is where many of the administrative meetings with other ministries and do take place in those days, but then still the height and the scale along with its volume, it represents a kind of how a power is shaping these ideologies. It is about 4 hectares, and this particular courtyard, they have hosted a lot of a large number of people, and they are very much I mean, this particular place they have conducted a choreographed rituals. And the one important thing one has to think about in the ground level is the pavement, which is the earth, and which was marked out with rank markers. So basically on the east, the ministers and the civil officials were ranked above the military officers to the west. So basically, even within that, the wide courtyard, so you are actually the 4 hectares of courtyard, you are actually, these are marked with these certain positions. That also indicates that, you know, this is for the ministers, this is for the civil officers, and this is for the military officers. And the raised platform is about 8 meters higher than the court, and the throne is about 50 meters. It's not, the throne is not just, you have the platform here, but the throne is not just here, but it is almost 50 meters at the back from the edge of the terrace, so that, you know, no one was permitted in that hall when the emperor was present. And the kowtow is a kind of the traditional way of how one show a respect. So this is a form of, so they basically they bend on their knees and they touch their head to the floor. So this is a kind of kowtow. So whenever the king is passing by. So you can see the present day's interior, the throne and the ceiling. Again, it has a raised platform. Within that, the hall, again the king is positioned at a higher place. It's about 2 meters height. So in that way, it signifies his position. And so the whole idea of this forbidden aspect, because the king is hardly seen any time, the emperor is hardly seen. So that is where the place of power was where one could see without being seen. So this is a very important understanding how the Chinese, the kingdoms, both the Ming and Qing dynasties have actually looked into it. And so in fact, when we move to further this, I think you can see here, this is where much of the everyday practices of power in the inner court, this is what we refer to as a kind of inner court. So here you have a series of 3 monumental buildings, you know, and mainly you have the Hall of Supreme Harmony and Hall of Central Harmony and Hall of Preserved Harmony. And if you move further down, and this is where it's about 100 meter to 100 meter by 200 meter enclosure, which is inner court, was the inner sanctum of the emperor and empress. So here again, you have, this is the court which we are talking about, and mostly it is a little of the place for these royals, and you know, where basically the emperor and empress, but though it is not their living quarters, but still much of their activities do take place. Now here, one of the important monuments which you can see is the Palace of Heavenly Purity. Here, this is where you can see that an emperor sits here, and he normally used to receive officials or emissaries, and its square forecourt with terrace and steps replicates the ensemble at the Hall of Supreme Harmony. So basically, but it's almost sometimes a half of the scale of what you see. It is almost a half of scale of what you get the court of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. And the second building, which is about Palace of Earthly Tranquility, and this is again, it is mostly a kind of a residence, a royal residence of Empress. In this, they have the kind of personal wardrobes, a huge, this kind of, it's mainly dedicated to the kind of royal empresses. And the third one, which we talk about, is the Hall of Union, where sacred objects were stored, because this is the hall why we are talking about Hall of Union. That is where it is a kind of interface between heaven and earth, between yin and yang in the Taoist philosophy, and the male and female, and the emperor and the empresses. That is where it's a kind of meeting point. And all the precious objects of the various royal specifics, and as well as the sacred objects, they are all stored in this particular hall. So what Dove has explained in our previous lectures, he actually adopts space syntax as an assessing tool. So how these spaces are actually connected, and how these power, in order to identify the role of how the power mediates within the built form, like we did talk about in the Hitler's case, about even the Germania and also his chancellor's building, how he talks about using gamma analysis in analyzing these spaces. Here one can see, so basically in this is probably who have worked on this particular projects on the space syntax analysis. If you look at this map, he identifies as 4 distinct zones, and two of them are basically the ceremonial approach through the outer court and then the inner court. So basically you can see that you have the ceremonial approach, and how they are coupled with some kind of flanking palaces. You have the Hall of Supreme Harmony, Hall of Unity. So this is basically they are coming in between in a sequence, but then it is within these 2 zones. One is the inner and the outer zone, and in inner you can see that there are a couple of 3 palaces, and in the outer you have the 3 palaces. And then you have on one side you have the military gate and the civil open space, which are again, so you can see that this is the converging point, and then it again bifurcates. But all these 4 zones, how they are linked is basically with the rear courtyard. So this is a very interesting part. If someone can look at this of so this space where we are after this is the rear outer court, and this is actually connecting almost all the 4 zones. But if one start analyzing these flow charts of how the sight lines and how the connecting patterns do emerge, and how it is actually, how it is distributed through the power forces, how it is within the component of the power and as well as the privacy, and the concept of to be seen and meant to see but not to be seen, how these barriers also are managed. So if one look at it, it's basically the deepest realms. If you look at the inner court, which is they are coming into the most of the deepest realm of the Forbidden City, and whereas the outer component, which is of the outer court, so this is how, because these are mostly dedicated for these emperors and their concubines. So it's more of a kind of, it's all prohibited for any others to enter into it. But the path into and out of this realm for ministers and officials was strongly controlled by the rear outer courtyard. So this is the connecting point from the inside to out and everything. So within the ministers and the civil servants, this is the kind of connecting part. And now we talk about a little bit of how the power is hidden, in terms of, this is where the historical evidences also talk about, especially when in 1856 onwards, like in 1861, when Tongji became emperor at the age of 5, and this is a kind of portrait of a Chinese emperor, and his mother Empress Dowager Cixi, and she is very well known from in the Chinese history, because if you look at when he was 5, he was made to sit on the throne, and a curtain, what you can see is a curtain, and behind that Tongji, the small boy, used to sit there, and most of the empire was, all the decisions were communicated. She, Cixi, Imperial Dowager Empress, she actually had a control, and though putting the emperor at the backstage, that is where the emperor is completely not seen, but then all of them are communicated through her. And as soon as after the death of the Tongji Emperor in 1875, and then she made the Cixi had made one of her nephew as the succeeding emperor, which Yuangsu. And as soon as he became the emperor, I think his ideologies are more towards a kind of his openness and how he's looking at a kind of the Western movements and other things. And at some point he was again, some of the records talk about that he's been jailed, and finally he died in 1908. And that is where we often refer as a kind of the end of imperial power. So that is where he says, one can never forget the power of the emptiness at the center, because one is forever forbidden to see it. So in fact, there was no emperor sitting. Ideally, there was no powerful, but it was an empty thing. But then, but no one is able to see that. What is that happening inside? No one have an idea how the rules and regulations, how the implications coming out. So it is completely invisible, and it is all hidden monarchy. So with the end of imperial power in 1911, so obviously the power have actually moved from Forbidden City to Zhongshan. So which means it's about in 1915. Obviously, this is where it's a major movement of once the imperial rule have ended, it has opened up to the kind of the party establishments. And in 1915, this particular place was a kind of as a government enclave. And then in 1948, again this compound became a residential enclave for party leaders. And especially Mao, who was actually a son of a wealthy farmer, and Mao Zedong, he started this kind of movements in China. And finally, he chose a residence of a traditional compound built by then emperor in 1795. In fact, what you see here is now the power is no more here, but the power is gradually moving out. So coming to 1949's Mao Zedong, and he proclaimed the foundation of the People's Republic of China, and a single party state controlled by the Communist Party of China. So it's basically a kind of a socialistic movement. And people have people have looked at this. Here you can see a huge painting of Zhang Jianxi at Tiananmen Square, very much at the entrance of the outer court. In the Tiananmen Gate, you can see that a large portrait of Mao put himself. And now this has produced two kinds of meanings. One, it was a hidden power submitting itself to the people, right? So obviously it is giving a message that yes, the power has submitted itself to its people. And the second way the people have looked at it is a new leader appeared in the imperial relationship to the people. So obviously this transition is one of the important phase in China. And this particular square, obviously with the kind of modern movements and a pressure from ideologies from the Western, and also various tax reforms and people coming under various pressure, because this transition is always a very difficult transition, because suddenly many reforms will take place at the same time. And that is how we call it as a kind of liberated space. And then he defined, the other side of the Tiananmen side, which is formulated as a Tiananmen Square. And when we talk about Tiananmen Square, this has become a kind of center of a modern public place in China. And this is a story where all the powers have been narrated, and where people come and gather for any kind of march or any kind of demonstrations. And that is how it is showing a window for any dialogue to happen in a political square. But in 1989, especially on June 4, there's been a series of revolutions, cultural revolution, I think in our previous, in 1966, the cultural revolution have taken place, and following that 1989, a huge massacre have happened between various student groups of Beijing and who have demonstrated. I mean, the official record says maybe a few hundreds, but in many other media records say that a few thousands and thousands of people died in that massacre. And that is where, after that, following the 1989 protest, that has become a kind of a landmark history in China. And people now, once a liberated space of this people of this kind of Tiananmen Square, which is giving an openness for everyone to participate and come and demonstrate. But now after this, it has again started converting into kind of forbidden space now, and different rules have been imposed on to control these and in order to maintain these. And they have also talked about how certain limitations have been put forward in the Tiananmen Square. So that is where Dove calls it again forbidden space too. So in the conclusion, the Forbidden City is largely reproduced its practices of power through a deeply segmented spatial syntax. And it takes many forms. Forbidden space takes many forms. It is all too easy to identify the open and closed as congruent with liberty and constraint, and transparent and hidden. So in fact, after this whole Tiananmen massacres and various series of massacres which happened from 1916 and later on as well, so that is where a monument of people's heroes has been constructed, dedicated to the people who lost their lives. So what this whole story is talking about, the forbidden space, once it was in the hidden walls, and at some point in a century's time, it came out of the walls as a liberation space. And even with the same set of openness, still it has converted into a forbidden space, in a different version. So what we are learning here is a kind of how the forbidden space is not just only within the limited walls or in the hidden part of it, but the meanings associated, they keep changing with the kind of political reforms do take place. And thank you very much. This lecture is basically developed on the readings from Dove, Framing Places, Mediating Power with Built Form. Thank you very much.